Now the next layer, the next context. So we've talked about context, and now we're talking about context. So the third context. The third context is the sentence or word context. So we're zooming in. We've started out at the book level with its broad context, and then the section level, and now we're zooming into the word and the sentence to try and figure out. And the reality is that those higher levels affect these lower levels. That's why we start out at the higher levels. So even at this level, at the sentence level, you start looking around the sentence. So what are the surrounding sentences? How do these sentences fit into the outline, into the flow of thought there? How do they fit into the flow of thought in this paragraph? Every paragraph has a flow of thought. Then you look at the actual sentence structure. What does the word do in the sentence? What part of speech is a word? What does it do? Is it a verb? Is it a noun? Is it an adjective, adverb, etc.? What's its range of possible meanings? So, for example, slave. That's what we've just been talking about. What is the range of meaning of the word slave? Words have words have a range of meaning that was assigned to them at that point in time, and that's what matters. Not our range of meaning for the word, but the range of meaning at that time, and what words could replace it. So in the Bible, could they have replaced it with the word for servant? The word for slave is doulos. The word for servant is diakonos, which we use as deacon. Deacon is actually diakonos in the Greek. So they're actually different words. Could they? That constrains the meaning of the word for slave. It means a slave isn't just a servant. It's not one word for somebody who serves you. A slave is a specific type of thing. And how do the surrounding words restrict the meaning? So in this case, the word slave is restricted by the fact that it's talking about households. So we know that it's a household slave because of the surrounding words in that paragraph. Okay? And for best results, for this sort of, when you're looking at words and sentences, to really dig into it, you need to either use multiple translations, as we were talking about before, or use tools that help you with the original language, in this case Greek. Logos does a great job of that. So if you're really keen, you can start playing with that. Another tool that I used when I was a youngster, many, many years ago, before computers, well, before the internet, was Strong's Concordance. Strong's Concordance.
I think we've got ours.
Yeah. Strong's Concordance actually gives you, when you look up a word from the KJV, it gives you all of the Greek words that are translated into that English word, and then it gives you a number, and you can actually find where those Greek words are used. So you can see the way that the underlying Greek works a little bit with Strong's.
You can get it like an NIV concordance. It doesn't have to just be Strong's.
Nowadays, computer tools like Accordance or Logos are much, much better and easier to use than Strong's. But if you're familiar with Strong's, then it's still a useful tool.
I've got something at home, don't I?
I like using Bible Gateway for word studies.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't tried it. There are some other tools online as well. Yeah. So, slaves, you must always obey your earthly masters. So the context, it's what we've got written here. Notice that this is all of these commands are part of pairs. So wives do this, husbands do that. Children do this, parents do that. Slaves or bond servants, that's the ESV that uses the word bond servants, and so does the RSV. Bond servants do this, masters do that. right? So that tells you that these are all...
So James uses bond servants, doesn't he? In James.
Yeah, it's just an attempt to express the fact that these aren't like Southern
slaves.
American slaves.
They're not slaves.
Well, they are slaves, but they're not Southern American slaves. So, most modern translations just use the word slaves because they assume that we've got over the, the American thing.
Bond servants were there for life, weren't
A bondservant is basically a slave. They're bonded to their master.
That's the same indentured service
Isn't
that
that
we
where
made.
they actually pierced an ear or something?
That's the Jewish law.
Yeah.
So
just
these are
remember
Roman.
bond
These are
servants.
Roman slaves. So they have a
Okay.
different protocol. They could earn their freedom if they were really good slaves and their master felt like giving them their freedom. They could get their freedom and then they'd be freedmen and they'd have all the rights of a free
It
man.
was a free slave. That's what it was, wasn't it? It was a free slave. The bond, because I'm just looking at the ESV. It doesn't say a bond servant, but the New King James referred to it as a king, as a
yeah.
bond.
Yep.
Bond servant.
Yep. So another interesting thing that you can see just by looking at the text is that here's wives and husbands, right? 2 verses. Children and fathers, 2 verses. Bond servants and masters. It's like, how many verses is that? It's a whole bunch of verses. It's like Paul just goes absolutely crazy telling these slaves what they need to do, like how they should behave. And
could it be that there was a bit of a problem in the town or the city regarding that?
well, I think the fact that Onesimus was there indicated that there was a problem, right?
Yeah.
And Paul's partly addressing the issue of Onesimus and Philemon in this letter as well. Not just in Philemon itself, but in this letter as well, he's addressing it. And it's almost like this is on his mind, and he's like, just blah, 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 I'm just going to go on about it.
There must have been some contention or some not working at, because he said, work hardly as if you were working for the Lord. There was obviously some dissent amongst the slaves, and I'm not going to work my guts out anymore like I used to. I'm just going to float along.
Yeah, it's as if they expected, now that we're all Christians, we can just do what we want and you have to forgive us. So you don't get to tell us what to do,
Yeah.
And that certainly comes across in Philemon as well.
Yeah. And that would be a problem in the society.
It would be a huge problem. And
it's pretty relational to what we go through these days.
I think so too. I think this is so important for us.
If we look at it as employee versus
Yeah.
your boss, we kind of see that. We can sort of see that.
Yeah. And the beauty of these, I just love the way that Paul is so balanced. Everything is balanced in his writing, and he gives these radical commands to wives: submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. But he gives these radical commands to the husbands, although this one's not as radical as the Ephesians version, which says, husbands, love your wives,
Put that into balance.
and give up your lives for them, just as Christ did for the church. Right? That's the Ephesians version, but this one just says, don't be harsh with them. But that's probably pretty hard for guys as well, to be honest, at times.
Never. Never.
It says, do not be harsh.
That's called
There.
getting
Well, this is hard too. Do not provoke your children. I mean, you're supposed to do that. They're so provocative.
Was Paul
Yeah,
have
and-
teenagers?
teaching.
So, here's looking at different translations, right? This helps you with the words. So if you're trying to figure out what the words mean, we can see that it's mostly slaves, but ESV is bondservants. So that helps us think, well, perhaps we should go and look up what slaves actually were in the Roman Empire, and we've already done that. Then obey, no real disagreement there, so that word is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
This one, everything, always, all things, everything. It seems a pretty clear meaning. There's not a great deal of range in that.
There's no grey in it, is there?
No. One thing to remember in Scripture, this is panta, the Greek underlying it, panto or pantas, I can't remember. But it's the general word that means all. And it's exactly like our English word. All doesn't mean exactly 100%. It means all according to the context, right? So if I say everyone came on Sunday, and somebody says, no, so-and-so, like Tom didn't come. It's like, well, yeah, he's in America, so of course he didn't come. So
Everyone else did that.
yeah, so it's context sensitive. And that's the case here. You've got to remember the context. The context is households and obeying Christ. So if your master tells you to worship another god, which is in the category of all, if we're thinking of it literally and sort of computerishly, but in the context it's not in the category of all. So we don't have a problem. You've got to remember to interpret the language sensibly and in the context. Then earthly, this idea of what sort of master it is, earthly master. It seems a little funny. Why do they have to say earthly or human? Like, what is the point of that? In the Greek, it's actually according to the flesh.
Is it because they are Christians? So that they have to acknowledge that, yes, you have God in heaven.
Yes,
You need
that's
to also obey who's
that's what it's
authority.
related to.
Okay.
This word, masters,
Masters.
is kyrios, which is exactly the same word that is used to refer to Jesus as Lord. It's actually Lord,
Okay.
your lords, your
Lord and
earthly
masters,
lords, your
yeah.
lords according to the flesh.
So is that-
So it's differentiating them from Christ. It's saying the people that have been placed over you, the humans who've been placed over you, you need to obey them.
Yeah, I thought it was putting emphasis on like the whole, how they kind of get rid of earthly when they talk about God, obviously.
Yeah. And
It's pretty-
when you know that this is the same word that refers to Christ, you understand why they need that adjective there.
yeah.
So
So then, Malcolm, in that scripture that says Christ is the head of every man, and then a man is the head of a woman, is it the same sort of idea in that context?
yes,
Yeah.
I think the context makes it clear that Christ's lordship requires this type of hierarchy within, or this type of respect or relationship, submission, mutual submission. Some people talk about it as being between humans, and it's all through the New Testament, and it's something that some Christians are very uncomfortable with, but it's all through the New Testament. So the question then is,
But that's because they're not. Is that because they're confusing the context and not looking at it as, because it is the same word as Christ? They're not saying that these people are Christ.
no, I think people bring their own philosophies to
So, for
Scripture
example,
and read it in.
like this idea of that God has said that husbands and wives are equally loved by God, equally important,
Mm.
but just
But there is no
different
role.
roles and different functions. Anyway, sorry, I might be getting you off the topic of it.
No, it's
No, that's right.
one of the things that we see in this is that as human beings in this age, because it's talking, remember in N.T. Wright's summary, he talked about this as life in the new age, right? So this is talking about the now, the intermediate age, the time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming, right? It's when we live as the church in a fallen world. In that context, how do we express our love for Christ and for our neighbour? How do those two fit together? And what Paul is saying is this way. If you read the beginning of Colossians, it talks about the supremacy of Christ, the primacy of Christ, and how he is in all and over all sustains all, and all this sort of stuff, right? And then what does that mean for us now? And this is an expression of that. It means that we actually live in a certain way, but it doesn't mean that we get to just be hippies and just go off into the bush and like just smoke joints and
have no responsibility. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, God forgives me for everything.
yeah. A lot of people would have thought that, and some Christians did that sort of thing.
No responsibilities.
Amen to that.
It's almost Paul's saying it's actually almost the opposite. It means that we actually have responsibilities and we have to work them out. And Paul says those responsibilities aren't radically different from what they were before. Husbands are still responsible to do this. Wives are still responsible to do this. Kids and parents still have responsibilities to each other, and slaves and masters still have responsibility to each other. So the world is turned upside down, but it's turned upside down in our hearts, not in the structure of society.
Yeah.
So we're not like the Labor Party trying to change the rules. We've changed the people, right? Things need to change, but the things that need to change are hearts, not the structures of society.
But it's also saying everyone needs a boundary.
Yeah.
You've got to have a guideline for things. It's
Yeah.
not that you don't want, that God doesn't want you to be free, but there's freedom in boundaries as well, because you know your limit, you know what's best for you and what's
Yeah.
best for your child, and it follows all the way down.
And we have different responsibilities. And that's important. That's something that as Australians we struggle with a little, I think. The idea that some people are masters and some people are slaves. We don't have that specific relationship, and we'll talk a little bit about the equivalence. But we still have husbands and wives, and the Bible talks about husbands and wives as having different responsibilities. That's a real struggle, and modern Christianity struggles with that. So we've got two strands of interpretation at the moment called, what are they called again? Egalitarian.
Headship theology and
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Like, was that reflecting
Egalitarian
the culture
and
of the
complementarian.
oh yes.
Time? Was that reflecting the hierarchical culture of the time, or was it meant to be an enduring?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And in this passage by itself, it's not entirely clear. So you have to ask the question: is Paul just talking about the structures of Roman society? But in other parallel passages, such as Ephesians, which is very, very parallel, Paul directly links the relationship between a husband and a wife to Christ and the church.
Yeah.
And in other passages, Jesus himself links the relationship of a husband and wife to Adam and Eve's relationship. So the New Testament talks about husbands and wives, at least, in a way that's based on human nature, not on the cultural norms of the time.
I think it's very interesting how it talks about a covering. You know, it uses the term covering, headship, and then it talks us about the angels ministering. And you know, I've heard one guy I like to listen to called Tony Evans. He talks about the roles and responsibilities in the relationship, and he talks about that, you know, Christ is the head of every man. A man is the head of a woman. And then he talks about that if the roles aren't in the right relationship or position, he talks about that it sort of inhibits the angels protecting or operating on the woman's behalf.
Okay, that's interesting.
You know, that it talks about the covering on the head.
It's symbolic of something.
Yeah, like the covering.
Yeah, there's a lot to wrestle with in this, and even in the relationship between men and women in the New Testament, there are elements that do seem to be culturally specific, such as the idea that women have to cover their heads, right? And that's in fact, that one's pretty easy because Paul indicates that that's culturally specific, because he throws up his hands and says, well, if you disagree with me, well, everyone does it that way. So, you know, there you go.
Yeah, Mike, just as an aside here, when I was about to get married, there was a woman in our church that's back in America. She's an elderly woman. And she said, the best advice I can give you is, she said, make sure that you really, really think your husband-to-be is going to make intelligent decisions. She said, and she was totally serious, and she said, because she said, when you get married, you say you're going to obey him. And she said, it'll be very hard if you marry somebody who really is a bit of a fool.
Well, that's good advice.
And it was very good advice, and I actually took that advice.
My husband, he's hiding behind
And
me.
I have
He's
I
being
have
very
been
intelligent.
very,
at the moment.
very happy in marriage, because I really looked at him and I thought, now, do I think, not just that he's smart, but do I think he's a wise sort of person? Because I'm going to have to do that. And so I did take that in my marriage vow, but of course nowadays a lot of women will not take that vow. They just feel it's, you know.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I don't give them a hard time sometimes.
Well, it's, yeah.
Intelligent debate.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Malcolm, it's 1:45.
Yeah.
I don't know how much more you got to
No,
go.
we're almost done.
Okay.
The next section is wrestling with this issue of how we actually apply it to ourselves, and to do that we need to wrestle with the issues that we've been talking about. So for this particular passage, we looked at, this is another way to look at the word, this is the other way that I said, looking at the original language. So if we do a Bible word study in Logos, this is one of the things that we get, and I'll explain what these are. So this is the original Greek word, doulos. There's actually a ship called the Doulos, one of the and there's one called the Logos as well.
Yeah, it's Logos.
And doulos, the Greek word, is translated this much in the New Testament as servant, servants, or servants. And you'll see lots of gospel. In fact, this over here is a map of the usage of the word doulos in the New Testament. So you can see it's used a lot in the Gospels. They're the pale blue. It's used a little bit throughout the Pauline letters, and that's Acts, and a bit through this is probably Peter, and throughout Revelation. And it's translated a little bit, however much that is, a sixth or something, an eighth, as slaves, and about an eighth as bondservants. This is from the ESV.
And that just depends on context, or?
So if you wanted to see where it depends on the context. So if you clicked on this on the software, it would give you a list of all of the places where it's translated that way, and you can see what the context is. But for this word, it's fairly simple because its range of meanings is fairly small. Some words, because the concepts of the words are quite different, they have vast arrays of different words that they translate as, and you'll get a circle that's got all these tiny little wedges. It's fun, but that's what's called that's the range of the meaning. That's the semantic range, which is the range of the meaning. And the alternative, a way to narrow what the word means, is if you look up the English word slave and see the Greek words that it's translated from. There aren't any others, so there's not many alternatives for this word. So it's a fairly simple word. It's just the historical and legal meaning that's hard, and that's what the Dictionary of New Testament background is good for. So if this sounds complicated, this is just normal research, right? This is what they teach in high school. Just not about the Bible.
Yeah, I'm okay with this.
So far we need a study Bible, maybe an introduction, although the study Bible has, if you get the ESV, you'll have all of that stuff, and maybe a Dictionary of New Testament background. That's a really handy one. And a copy of Logos or something. there's free stuff that has this capability in it.